Good day. Students, welcome. It's class time. I am Gail Winter Farquharson, and I will be guiding you through CSEC Agricultural Science. This week, we are going to look at supply and demand. Let's start our lesson. So today's lesson, we'll be looking at supply and demand and how it impacts pricing in the market space. Today's objectives are: 1, to define the terms demand and supply. 2, explain the law of demand and supply. Discuss factors that influence demand and supply. Determine the relationship between demand, supply, and pricing. And 5, explain the concept equilibrium. Let's dig in. Here we have two images. On your left, we have an image that represents tomatoes in March. On your right, tomatoes current time, December. So in March, the cost for tomatoes was actually $30 per pound. Currently, the price for tomato is actually, can anybody guess? $400 per pound. Yes, $400 per pound for tomatoes. Now, what has influenced the change in price is what we call demand versus supply. So there's an increase in price for tomatoes by $370. Now, let's dig further. Let's picture the market space as the scale. On our left, we have an image that represents production. Production is what we talk about as, or we could refer to as, supply. Supply speaks on the seller's point of view. So notes that will be taken today, we will be looking on the impact of these from the seller's point of view. Then we look at the right side of our scale today, which looks on demand. Demand speaks to consumption, and this will be taken from the buyer's viewpoint. Now, let's break them down. What is demand? Demand is the principle referring to a consumer's desire to purchase goods and the willingness to pay a price for a specific good at a given time. So it's the ability of the consumers to purchase items at various prices at specific point. And again, demand leads or goes hand in hand with consumption. Next, supply. What is supply? Supply is a concept that describes the total amount of specific good that the producer makes available to consumers at specific price over a period of time. So this is the amount of good that the seller can present to the market space that consumers can purchase at a particular price at a particular point. Now, how does pricing impact supply? How does it impact demand? We look at what we call the laws. So let's look at the first one, which is the law of demand. The law of demand. The law of demand states that a high price will lead to a low quantity demanded, and the reverse. A low price would lead to a high quantity demanded. Let's look at tomato, right? So if the price for tomato increases, the amount that will be demanded will be reduced. Because, being realistic, if the price for something goes up, if you normally would buy, let's say, 5 pounds of tomato, this week you'll buy 3 because there's an increase in price. And if the price actually falls, you'll buy more. Practical, right? So the law states that the increase in price would actually cause a reduction in the amount of items that is demanded. Let's look how price impacts supply. That is called the law of supply. So let's look back at tomatoes again so you can better understand. Now, the law of supply states that a higher price leads to a greater quantity supplied, and that a lower price, which is the reverse, leads to a lower quantity that is supplied. So, tomatoes again, right? So let's say the price for tomatoes has increased. Now, this would lead to an increase in supply because from an economic standpoint, if you're a supplier and you realize that, you know what, the cost for tomato is now $400, I'm going to increase the amount of tomatoes that I supply in the market space. But if the price reduces, more than likely you're going to pull back on the amount. And to actually satisfy this, I mean, some farmers normally turn to other ventures to say, here, when I might have too much tomatoes, so I'm going to actually sell these tomatoes to maybe factories to create tomato paste. Understand? Because it costs to actually store these items and to secure these items. So to store them would actually be a greater cost in comparison to having a low cost. So we're going to look at the flip now. The flip is, how does these factors, which are demand and supply, affect pricing of items? Now, the table here that I have speaks to demand and supply. So one, we have, let's say supply remains constant, and we increase the amount of demand. This increase in demand will cause an increase in pricing. And let's say the demand reduces. If the demand reduces, we're going to look at the prices being increased. Flip, prices being decreased, Then let's look at the demand. If demand remains constant, our supply will increase. And if our supply increases, the price for items would normally decrease. And if we have supply being reduced, we look at prices going up. So these items are all factored right around looking at how these prices are impacted by supply and by demand. Before I break down the table, let's look at two key terms. We have complementary and substitute goods. First, complementary goods. Complementary goods are consumed together. These items are normally utilized together. So for example, we have here common, rice and peas. Those are what we call complementary items. And we have, typically when you go to the shop to buy scallion, they give you a pinch at a time, right? Because those two items are actually complementary. So can you think of another complementary item that's sold together? I'm sure somebody said bun and cheese, right? And true, it's actually complementary items as well. Next one is substitute goods. Substitute goods, these are items that are consumed in place of the other. So if one is not available, the other would have been your, plan B. So for example, you go to the market to buy lettuce, right? Lettuce not available or it's expensive, what would you do? Purchase cabbage instead. So we'll say that lettuce and cabbage are substitute good. You can use one in place of the other. Pork and chicken. This Christmas, I'm sure you're going to have a wide variety of pork options and bacon and ham and all of that, right? But if the price for this pork goes up, I'm sure you're going to have a wide variety of chicken because chicken will be maybe more reasonable. So you can have baked chicken, stewed chicken, curry chicken, right? So these items are items that are used in place of another. So we have complementary good and substitute good. So let's break down our chart, our table. Let's look at first how demand impacts pricing. So first, demand increases. No change in our supply, price will increase. So demand increase based on the amount of items that we have available. So let's say we're looking at tomato so you can better understand. If the demand for tomato increases, which means more persons are requiring tomato, because one, maybe the season for tomatoes, right? Or it's a booming business that people want to actually produce a tomato paste. So the increase in demand goes skyrocket. There's a rapid increase for tomato. So this would say, you know what? If the increase in demand is there for tomato, the price eventually will be higher. The selling price would rise because more persons want the items. Hence, you would have an increase in pricing for these items in the market space. And let's look at the flip. Let's look at demand. If the demand for tomato falls, which means nobody is really buying tomatoes anymore, what will happen is that the price would have to go down. Because if the farmer or the seller does not reduce his price, what will happen is he will have an oversupply of this item in the market space. And having an oversupply of items would lead to what? Wow. Can I say more? it will lead to a wide variety of different challenges. So what the farmer would have to do is reduce the price of these items. So a reduction in demand would cause a reduction in the pricing of these items. Let's look at a scenario case today. 1. So due to the COVID-19 pandemic, the government has restricted the importation of Irish potato to reduce the risks of contracting the virus from high-risk countries. The action has caused a shift by consumers to yam in the market space. How will this affect the price for yam? This question was actually structured by one of my class batches, which is Mr. Colin Chen. So let's look at the question further. If we're going to break down this question, it's asking you more than one thing. One, we have an item that is no longer being drawn into our country. So we no longer have access to Irish potato. So consumers now turn to what? A complementary or substitute? Right. They will now turn to a substitute good. So now they would want yam to purchase. Now wanting yam to purchase would impact the price for yam because now we have an increase in the demand for yam. What will happen? 1, the decrease in the supply of Irish potato, which is the obvious because now there's a ban on the importation. 2, increase in the demand for yam. So once you have an increase in an item, over time you'll have an undersupply. So here we'll have maybe a shortage in yam over a period of time. Now the result, how the demand would impact the price for yam is that now we would have an increase in the price for yam because we have an increase in the demand for yam. So once you have an increase in the demand for an item, we will normally have an increase in the price of these items within the market space. Now, let's go further to look at the demand impact on prices. Now, scenario case number 2, you'll try on your own. Let's go. So, the question says, how will the re-importation of potatoes affect the demand for yam? How does a change in demand affect the price for yam? So again, this question, hold a break, we're going to go to a break and then return. But however, let me read before we go to such break. How will the re-importation of potatoes affect the demand for yam? How does a change in demand affect the price for yam? So remember, look at the table above and it will actually guide you in how best to answer the question. Let's look if you guys got the questions correct. The answer correct. So let's see what would happen. Yes, we'll have a demand in and decreasing demand for yam. Also increasing supply for Irish potato because at this point now the reimportation of potato is as obvious. Now what will happen to the price for yam? Right. The price for yam would now decrease because there is competition on the market space. So now based on that fact now, customers are not only targeting just yam, they have options. This will lead to a reduction in the pricing for the item. So now let's look how supply impacts price. Now, the diagram here speaks to supply and its impact on pricing in the market space. So let's say demand remains constant. Supply would increase or supply increases. And if supply increases, the price for items would actually be reduced. So if you have an increase in supply of tomato in the market space, the price will fall. And you have an undersupply, the price would increase. So if you have an oversupply of items in the marketplace, what will happen is that the farmers or the sellers want to get them off their hand. So they would sell them for, as in Jamaican term, little and nothing, right? So I can remember back then, $20 per pound for tomatoes, $10 per pound. I'm serious. That's how low sometimes prices go once you have an oversupply of items in the market space, or would say a surplus of items in the market space. Then we look at having supplies being reduced. If supply decreases, the price would naturally go up in the snap of a finger. Because once you have a shortage of an item, I only have 5 tomatoes in my hand. Here what? Hot potty. You remember that term, right? What will happen is that who can afford it? So it was for, let's say, $400 today. When you come back next week when I have less tomatoes, it'll be $500. Because if you don't know, currently by maybe the end of this program, sweet peppers will be $1,000 per pound in the market today. That's how it goes. So once you have an undersupply of an item, the prices skyrocket. So let's look at a scenario case. Manchester, rather, has recorded an increase in the reports on the negative impact of heavy rains on the production of melon in the parish. How will this supply and price for melon be affected? So there's a negative impact on the heavy rains we had the other day on melons in the parish. So how will this impact the supply of melon and the price for melon? Let's see if you're thinking. What will happen? Give you about a minute. Let's take a second. Let's see if you guys are correct or with me. The price of melon will what? The price of melon will increase because we now have a shortage. Great. Next, there will be a decrease in supply for melon. And what will happen to the price for melon? The price for melon, as it said before, would increase. Great. So you're with me. Let's flip it around. What would happen on the flip side if we now had an increase in the amount of melon supplied? What would happen? The price would what? The price would decrease because now we have an oversupply of melon in the market space. And also the amount of melon, would increase, as obvious. So it does impact the pricing. Supply and demand does affect the price for items. So now we're going to look further on how these items are normally represented. These actions are represented on tables. So we now look to what we call the demand schedule. The demand schedule is a table that represents the prices and quantity demanded at various prices. The demand curve and the demand schedule that we're going to look at, these are actually tools that we use to summarize the relationships between the quantity demanded and the price for a good. So as we revert to looking at the law of demand, it states that what? The higher the price, the reduction in the amount of items that is demanded. And the table speaks as just. So when the price is $10, the amount demanded would be basically maybe nothing because it's expensive. And if the price reduces to $8, 2 pounds will be demanded. So therefore it looks on as the prices decrease, the amount of items demanded would increase. So the higher the price, less demanded. The lower the price, the more items that is demanded in the market space. So let's look at the example. Putting our schedule on our curve. So this is what we call a demand curve. The demand curve slopes from left to right. This is a representation of tomatoes in the market space. So as we realize that we would match items together, so as our prices are reflected on the y-axis and our quantity would be represented on our x-axis. So here we have pairing together the point where we have when the cost for tomato is $10, we have a reduction in the amount or none is actually purchased. The price is reduced to $8. We have 2 kilograms of tomato that will be purchased and it goes on. So this reflection is showing you how the market space is reacting to prices over time. Now, what affects the curve is what we call factors, right? Factors impact demand curve. Factors, we're going to look at a few of them. We have price of the actual goods or service. We have income, change in price of the related items, advertisements, taste and preference and expectation. So let's look at one of them. Change in the price of related items. So let's say we have complementary goods. And we're looking at how rice complements peas. So if we have an increase in the demand for one item, it would impact the other item, right? Let's look at substitute items. Let's say we're looking at coffee and we're looking at tea. If we have an increase in the price for coffee, it would actually increase the demand for tea, because the price for coffee is so high, some persons will revert to the substitute, which is the tea. So hence you'll have an increase in the demand for tea. So that is how we look at how the change in these prices impact related goods. Let's look at income. How does your income impact your demand for items? If you have an increase in salary, this would impact your, basically, what you would buy in the market space. So let's say you got $1,000 extra for your salary, right? You would, instead of buying 5 pounds of chicken, you'd now maybe buy 10 pounds of chicken. But the flip side, if you have a reduction in your income, you maybe buy less of the items, or you maybe buy a substitute that is cheaper at that price point. So we look at how income impacts the basic. Now we look at the price of goods and services. As we said before, once the price for items increase, the demand for items, these items would actually be reduced. So let's look at another. Let's look at how we have something that is called a shift in demand. Now, a shift in demand, students, we look at a change in the determinants of demand except price. This will shift the demand curve. The curve shifts to the right if the determinants cause demand to increase, and shift to the left if it causes the demand to decrease. So, these determinants are what we call the factors that we looked at prior to this. So if one factor like income would basically cause an increase in demand, the curve itself would actually shift to the right. So as you'll see the diagram here, once these determinants impact the curve, we will have a change in position. So the curve will now shift to the right if these determinants cause an increase, and then shift to the left if these factors causes a decrease. So an increase would move to the right and a decrease would move to the left. The curve will shift to the left. Let's look at supply. Now, we have the supply schedule. Now here we have schedule. Now the schedules normally are a reflection of what the laws state prior. And as we said earlier, the law of supply states that once you have an increase in price, the supply will increase. So, a supply schedule is a table that shows the quantity supplied at different prices in the market space. A supply curve and schedule, both these are tools, as I said before, that actually shows the relationship between the amount of goods supplied and the price for these items. Now, so here we have a reflection, our schedule on board. Now, what we have here is that when the price is zero, nobody will want to supply if there's no value on these items. If the price increases to $2, the farmers would say, you know what, I'm going to supply a certain portion. So here we have 2 kilograms being supplied. Then we look at the price increase. So each time the price increases, so does the supply. So once the price for an item goes up, so will the supplier. They will say, you know what? The economic standpoint, I need to make more money because if this is expensive, I'm going to supply more because it's in a high demand in the market space. Let's break it down. Let's look at the curve and the schedule. So this is an example of a supply curve. Before we realized that the demand curve sloped from left to right. Here we have our supply curve. The supply curve slopes from right to left. Now, the curve here is a reflection of the demand schedule as seen here. So, as the prices increase, so will the quantity. And it's reflected on the table here on our Y and X axis, where at the price point of $10, 10 kilograms of tomato will be supplied. And it continues down until we have an increase, a decrease in the amount of items that will be supplied at various price points. So as we looked at before, we identified factors that impacted demand. Now, what factors would actually impact the supply of items in our market space? Now, here are a few items, a few factors. We look at price of goods and service, cost of production, technology, government policy, size of the market, expectations, and time. Let's highlight a few. So let's look at size of the market. So if there's an increase in supply, you have a wide variety of persons supplying an item, that means there's a large supply over time that will be present within the market space. So the size of the market would actually impact the amount of supply at any given time. We look at what we say is expectations. Let's look at future expectation. If you expect in the future that you're going to have an increase in the supply for, I'm going back to my tomatoes, if you're going to have an increase in the amount of tomatoes in the market space, that means that increase would actually impact you now. So you say, you know what? I'm not going to buy that much. I'm not going to produce that much now because in the future you're going to have that amount anyway. So these impact the amount of items supplied in the market space. Let's look at government policies. A few policies that we have are tax and subsidies. So the imposing of taxes on items, would, if you increase the amount of tax for an item, that will actually impact the supply. So we look at having these policies in place, and the tax itself would actually say, fine, if there's an increase in tax, you're going to have a reduction in the amount of items supplied. If the taxes are reduced, you would actually have an increase in the amount of items supplied. And say, be it subsidies. If items are subsidized by the government themselves, what will happen? It will influence and actually encourage farmers to actually produce more. And this would cause an increase in the supply for items as well. Now let's look at the price for goods that we spoke about earlier. This speaks on if you have an increase in price, you're going to have an increase in supply. We good, guys? So I'm guessing you're understanding a few of these concepts themselves. So let's look at a shift in the supply curve. So the curve shifts to the right if the determinants causes supply to increase, and it shifts to the left if it causes it to decrease. So once you have more goods being supplied at every single price point, this would cause a shift in the actual curve. So if we have an increase in the amount of items supplied, the determinants causes a change in the position of the curve. We will have the curve moving to the right. And if we have the determinants causing the price points to change right across the area, we're going to have a shift to the left of the actual curve. So the supply curve will shift to the right if there's an increase in supply, and will move to the left if there's a decrease in supply. Now, these two price points would actually, at some point, we're going to have our supply and our demand coming together. What we call this is our equilibrium, right? Now, our equilibrium point or price. The equilibrium point is where the supply and demand are equal, and they arrive at an equilibrium price, which is normally evident. So we will have both supply and demand curve on the same plotted together, and where both curves meet, we would have what we call an equilibrium. The equilibrium price is the market price where the quantity of goods demanded is equal to the quantity of goods that is supplied. So we're looking at having the obvious. So the blue dot here represents where we have the point where both the demand and the supply meets. And the red dot there speaks on the price that we would get when both our demand and our supply curve meet. So at this point will be the best price to sell items where we have our demand and our supply, they are both equal, right? So let's break it down a little bit further. Now, supply and demand. So here we have both the price, we're looking at the price for tomato, right? Now we're looking at where both our demand and our supply meet. So what happened here is that our equilibrium price point, can anybody look and tell me what would be the best price to sell tomato for in the market space based on our equilibrium point, where both curve meet? Right. So to make the most suitable point would have been where we have the price at $6 and 6 kilograms of tomatoes would have been sold. So the best price at this point would have been for $6 per pound, per kilogram. So here's where how the market space themselves try to generate price points throughout the actual time by utilizing our equilibrium. So over time, students, you're going to find that within our market space, we have a wide variety of different influences that causes the prices for items to increase or to decrease. So we have where we're going to look at the flip side of what we looked at initially. So initially, we identified the image here, right? And we found out that there was an increase in the price for tomatoes over the period of time. So it increased by $370. Right? So can you think to yourself, what could be some of the reasons why the tomato price increased over the couple of months? I'm giving you about a second or so to tell me. Let's see if you're correct. 1, there may be a shortage of tomato in the market space. That's very good. That's true. That could be a reason. 2, increase in the demand for tomatoes. So you're on the right track, right? So this would have been 2 important items that we could consider why the price for tomato has increased. Now, let's do a recap of what we did today. So 1, we looked at the demand and we looked at supply. Demand is the principle referring to a consumer's desire to purchase goods and the willingness to pay a price for a specific good at a given time. 2, we looked at supply. Supply refers to the concept that describes the total amount of a specific good or service that is available to consumers at a specific time. 3, we looked at some of the factors that impacted demand, which are a few. We have change in income, change in taste or preference, change in price of related items. We also looked at the factors affecting supply. We looked at price, production, cost, and technology. We also looked at complementary goods and substitute goods. Complementary goods are consumed together. Substitute goods are consumed in place of the other. An example, substitute good we look at, lettuce and cabbage. Good. Demand. So along with demand, demand along with supply determines the actual price of goods and the volume of goods that change. The price of a good is determined by the interaction of supply and demand. So students, I do hope today you guys actually got the concepts together or erased few of the doubts in your mind on what are some of the reasons why prices increase over time for goods and services. So today's quote is, what you see depends on how you view the world. To most people, this is just dirt. But to a farmer, it is potential. Again, to most people, this is just dirt. But to a farmer, a young farmer like you, see potential. Okay?